Okay, so we're going to talk about being a chair. We are not going to talk almost at all about basic adjudication, how we can decide which team is better. All of that, we're going to assume that you've seen or can go and see workshops about adjudication in general. We're going to be talking a lot about running the panel discussion. So how to get yourself and the other people to talk about the things that are relevant, how to deal with possible panel members that don't understand or don't want to understand what is relevant, how to give the rankings and how to give the feedback. If any of you have seen my previous workshops on panel discussions in general, there's going to be a little bit of overlap, but I'm hopefully not going to be more than 10 or 20% overlap. So hopefully it won't be too boring if you've seen those. Some of that overlap does come relatively in the beginning, so bear with me until the parts that get more interesting. We've had a lot of people sort of write to Dana specifically what they want to hear, and a lot of things were sort of very different. So what I am going to do, I'm going to leave quite a bit of time at the end for questions. Those questions can be sort of general things. Do you usually prefer doing X or Y? To which I will always answer, well, that depends, and then I'll try to say why and on what it depends. Or they can even be sort of specific situations. Hey, I remember around, I had a wing do this and this and this. What do you think you would do? To which I will always say, well, there's no really good answer if the situation is bad enough, but then I will try to explain what I think I would do in that sort of situation. And sometimes those things are useful. So if you have those, keep them in mind or write them down, and at the end we'll have a lot of time to go over quite a few. The first thing I want to talk about just a little bit is about people who are new to chairing. I'm going to talk about sort of generally how to do it well, but people who are new to chairing, I think there are a few things that are useful to do in the beginning to sort of have the transition into the point where you sort of know what you're doing and you're confident a little bit easier and faster. And the first thing is, you should keep in mind that a lot of the things, specifically the things that are pretty much the same in nearly every debate, they should become automatic pretty quickly. So what I say in the beginning before every speaker comes up in the introductions or gender introductions or whatever is needed in this Heroes of Worlds. The things you say in the beginning of the discussion. So, okay, let's take a minute or two to look at our notes, and then I'll ask each of you for your rankings without justification. Or what you say after those 1 or 2 minutes, right? So now I'd like from each of you a ranking or justification. It's absolutely fine if the rankings are not complete. It's absolutely fine if to be wrong and to change your mind later. But for now, no justifications, just 1, 2, 3, and 4 between the two. So you have those sort of very common things that you say in every debate, and those become automatic. What you want to do a lot of times to make your first few debates sharing easier is just prepare those in advance. So listen to another chair while you're a wing, or think through the times that you had, write them down, remember them, just come into the debate where those things aren't another stress on top of all the things that are different between different debates, and that just makes it easier to go through all of these. The second thing is that a lot of times it becomes easier when you aren't yet comfortable or confident in everything that you're doing, is to just over-prepare for a lot of things. So usually my philosophy is, I'd rather not think about emotion before the debate starts, because I don't want to sort of poison my own thinking with the specific clashes that make sense to me, or get to the point where if I'm missing something that I thought was very, very basic and important in the debate, does that change my way of thinking? If you're very new and you're not yet comfortable in being able to think through the discussion and the clashes and all the things, sometimes making that trade-off is worth it. So thinking through the motion in the time that you have, figuring out what are going to be the big things or the main things or the clashes, and then it sort of becomes easier. You need less time in order to sort of say, okay, this argument, I know where this argument goes. It goes into this clash. I've already prepared them. They might not be the best clashes for this debate, but they're clashes that work, which gives me more time as a new chair who's doing this for the second or third or fifth time to focus thinking on the other things. So I think over-preparing is something that you won't want to do forever, but you definitely want to do to some extent. And the last thing I'm going to say for new chairs is that, like, don't worry. New chairs screw up. Not new chairs, people who've been doing it for a long time, screw up. It's fine. If you're nice and polite and let people speak and care about what people say and then answer in a way that it's obvious that you were listening to the other person and not just saying what you were thinking ahead of time, people understand. It's all fine. It's also okay to say that you're new and not very confident. It's fine, like I would definitely say in the beginning of the discussion, if you're not sure what happened, look, I'm not really sure what happened in this debate. Let's talk through this together. I think one of the probably best experiences I've had judging, and one of the only times where there was someone where I didn't know, we judged the debate together and we were friends afterwards, was in my first international competition that I was chairing, that I was judging and chairing, and we were judging a relatively high room where the teams, specifically first opposition, screwed up completely. They challenged the definition and then for 14 minutes refused to tell us what the definition that they thought should be for the debate was, which caused the whole debate to be incredibly confusing. And then the wing that I had with me at the beginning said, look, I'm really sorry, I have no idea what went on in this debate. And then my answer was, yes, I also have no idea what went on in this debate. Let's go through this one by one. And that was probably one of the better judging experiences we both had, just because let's put it out on the table. We have no idea what's going on. If we go slowly, maybe we'll figure it out. And I think we eventually did figure it out, more or less. So that's sort of a very short part, just about if you're new, you're not really comfortable doing it, it's all going to be fun. Let's talk about specifics about what are the important things in guiding a discussion and the important things in making sure the discussion goes well. And the first thing, and this is a part that I think overlaps with the panel discussion lecture, and that is the most important thing to think about in any panel discussion is time. And the first thing you want to think about in time is to do the sort of basic math about what time looks like in a 15-minute discussion. And that math goes like this. Out of the 15-minute discussion, you usually will have a minute or two before you can actually start discussing things, because the teams need to leave and because people need to take time to go over their notes. And there's usually going to be a minute or two in the end where you can't really talk because you're doing speaker points and because teams are starting to come back in, because the runner is coming into the room and saying, you need to stop, you need to stop. And there's usually going to be maybe another minute that is wasted on either people saying completely irrelevant things, or on small talk, or on something else that's bothering you because somebody from the CA team is coming to ask questions of the chair. That means you'll usually have between 10 to 12 minutes of people, an actual judge talking about the debate. Now, the chair, depending on their style, can talk relatively little, which will come to about the chair talking about as much as an average wing. That would be a chair that's pretty laid back. Or can talk quite a lot, which would probably be, I think at most, in cases that aren't really strange, a chair talking about 3 times as much as an average wing. The sort of average normal case would be the chair talking about twice as much as an average wing. And so if we just do the very, very simple math, we'll get to the point where if you have a 3-person panel, that means every wing gets to talk between 2.5 to 3 minutes, and the chair gets to talk between 5 to 6 minutes. And if you have a 4-person panel, then every wing gets to talk about between 2 to 2.5 minutes, and the chair between 4 to 5 minutes. If you think about that for a minute, you realize that that is not a lot of time. That means that you need to make sure that if you're the chair, within 4 to 5 minutes, you can say all of the important things that you want and all of the relevant comparisons in the debate, including the back and forth that you'll need to do to convince a wing where you don't agree with each other. That means that every wing needs to be able to get their contribution to the debate within between 2 to 3 minutes about all 3 comparisons in the debate, including the back and forth where they need to convince the chair about it. So that has to be the framework that you come into the debate with in your mind. And that has to never leave your mind as you're the chair in the debate, because you always need to see where you are on that progress between we started, nobody has any idea what's going on, or fair enough, I have an idea about what's going on, but I don't know what ideas everyone else has, and they might be completely different ideas about what's going on, to we're ready to do speaker points. And the time is always ticking down into where do we utilize our time. This also means that usually the first thing you do after you sort of figured out for yourself what your ranking is, or the way that you in general see the debate, is have a sort of very tentative idea about how you want to utilize your time in this debate. It's very useful if you have cues from your wings about what they liked and didn't like in the debate. I do tend to try and notice a little bit as a chair if my wings are sort of nodding along to a certain team and then say, okay, they think that team is probably placed relatively highly. That'll maybe change how much I think whether they'll agree or disagree with me with some of the calls. The point where a team is saying absolutely nothing and you see like 3 wings all nodding together with them is like, well, okay, I need to make sure that I figure out and have time to talk about this team and what's going on there. And sometimes you're wrong. Sometimes chairs are just very polite and nod enthusiastically to a team that everyone will agree is the fourth. But it's probably a good sign into where you want to utilize your time. Definitely, as soon as you've heard the rankings that your wings give your teams, at that point you can definitely sort of have an idea about how much time you want to spend. And there are different ways to do this, right? You could say, let's start with the sort of easy things. Here are the 2 comparisons that I think we can get through quickly. If your wings are relatively cooperative and are willing to say, okay, we won't talk about everything we want to say about this, we'll just get through the main things and then move on, you can maybe check off a minute or 2, we finished with this comparison, a minute or 2, we're finished with this comparison, let's talk about the important part. Or you can do the other way around, right? We'll start with the hard stuff and then maybe we won't have a lot of time for the easy stuff, but fair enough, they're the easy stuff. Or you can do something different if it's relevant. So maybe there were a lot of really weird things going on in the top half and it becomes kind of difficult to talk about bottom half because top half did a lot of weird things, and so we have to start there anyway. But even if I do that, I have to keep in my mind, out of the 10, 12 minutes, do I think this bottom half is going to take 2 to 3 minutes? In which case, if I'm past 3 minutes and we haven't finished it, I need to figure out something's going wrong. Or do I expect, because top half was really weird, I now am going to spend 8 out of 12 minutes. In which case, I need to have some sort of plan about how the hell I'm going to do 2 minutes per comparison for the other 2 that I'm going to need to do. When you plan out your discussion, and when you actually start trying to guide the discussion to go along with your time plan, along with the plan of how you want to make the decisions, there are usually 2 big things you want to keep in mind. The first one is that you want as much of the conversation as possible to be relevant to making the decision about the rankings in the debate. We'll talk about what that means in a second. The second thing is you want to try and make sure that every person in the panel has a decent chance to express themselves in a way that's effective, in a way that's useful in the debate, in a way that if they saw something intelligent that nobody else did, that they'll have a chance to actually say it. I'll start with the second one. And I'll talk about letting people express themselves, because I think that's a lot of times sort of simpler and easier to talk about. My rule of thumb is, and it's not the goal, it's just sort of a good idea to tell if somebody has expressed themselves enough or not, is that I should be able to, at the end of the discussion, give them some sort of meaningful feedback about how they were in the discussion. That's not the goal. I don't let them express themselves so that I have feedback. But I think that's just sort of a good rule of thumb about if I'm able to provide meaningful feedback, if they come and ask me later, hey, was I good in the discussion? What could I have done better? If I'm able to say, here's what you did well, here's what you didn't do well, I think there's a good chance that that person has expressed themselves to a decent degree. If I'm able to, if the CA team asks for feedback, give sort of a number, right? So they were 7 out of 10, they were 10 out of 10, they were 5 out of 10, they were 2 out of 10. There's a good chance that maybe they didn't have a lot of time to express themselves, but they've had enough for me to be able to meaningfully assign a number. If I can't do that, there's a good chance that either they didn't express themselves or I wasn't listening to enough of it to be able to say that they had a meaningful contribution to the debate. So I think that's just sort of a proxy to how much is enough, right? And it'll depend on the different debates, right? So some debates, everything will be super obvious. They will have talked for 2 or 3 minutes, but because everything was super obvious, I don't know how to give them meaningful feedback. They also probably didn't get a chance to express anything interesting. I will say that when you want to let someone express themselves, there are probably 2 things that you'll be needing to do. The first thing is, if they are shy, or they're unsure of themselves, or they don't find a chance to speak just because there are enough people in the panel and people sort of talk enough, or because there's somebody specifically cutting them off, right? Just because people are talking and there's a flow and they're having a hard time sort of inserting themselves into that flow. You want to keep that in mind and create the opportunity for them to do so. And creating the opportunity usually means, first of all, I wouldn't put a person on the spot, right? I would ask, is there something you want to say? I'd love to hear from you about sort of these next 2 or 3 questions. Give them the chance to come in with something that they feel comfortable talking about. And definitely don't pressure people when they don't feel comfortable. Some people come to Euros to learn, and they'll sit and not talk a lot in all the panels, and I think that's not a great contribution to the panel, fair enough. But I think still on the spot, you don't want to pressure somebody into talking when they don't feel comfortable. But giving them the chance to say, I'd also love to hear you, usually on a sort of more general question makes it easier, on what you thought of this team. That gives them a chance to say the most brilliant and relevant and interesting things, but also give them a chance to say something that's not perfectly relevant, but gives them some sort of chance to engage with the conversation. I'll give up a little bit of relevance in order to give someone a chance to engage with the conversation. In the specific cases, and we'll talk about problematic wings in a little bit, but in the specific cases where somebody's cutting them off or not letting them speak enough, I think the most important thing, except for actually making sure that they get a chance to say what they want, is to take the reason that you are, as a chair, sort of coming in and stopping this person from cutting them off, or giving the permission to speak back to the wing who's been cut off, to take that reason onto yourself and not put it on the person who was just cut off. So say, I'm really sorry, I'm going to stop you there. I just really like to hear the end of what they were saying. Is a lot better than you didn't let them finish, right? So I don't want to put them in the position where they sort of through me, but asked to keep talking. I'll just take that on myself and say, I just really want to hear the end of that, and then let the other person speak. But don't make it between the 2 wings. Just take it on yourself. It's usually easiest to do, and also doesn't create situations that are uncomfortable. Let's talk about how you get the debate to the point where it is most relevant, because I think that's probably the more interesting and in a lot of ways most difficult thing. First thing, we need to ask, what does it mean a part of the conversation that's relevant? Every single debate will have a sort of tree of decisions that you need to make, where at the top of that tree, or the beginning of that tree, you'll have a ranking of the 4 teams, right? That's the end of what we want to do, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. And in order to make that decision, you'll need to make usually, or justify, three decisions, right? So Y is first ahead of second, second ahead of third, third ahead of fourth. Each one of those decisions is going to be split up into, usually, 2 or 3 or 4 major comparative decisions, right? So a comparative decision could be who won this clash, right? And it could be as simple as that. So we have 3 clashes, who won clash A, who won clash B, who won clash C, maybe then a comparative decision about which clash is more important if they don't all face the same way. But a comparative decision could also be who was able to explain some major point in a way that's more compelling, right? That's also sort of a comparative, who did something more than the other one, or who engaged with the other team to a better degree, or whose case was, let's say they both weren't very relevant to the debate, who was relevant to the debate to a larger extent than the other team. So there will usually be 2 or 3 or 4 major comparative decisions that you want to answer in order to be able to answer the question about which team is ahead. And each of those major comparative decisions will be split up into smaller decisions, sort of minor decisions, that might be comparative but also might not be comparative. So they still might be, right, so who made this point better, but they might be, did they prove what they set out to prove? It's not a comparative decision, it's a very specific minor decision that might go into assessing who won this clash, right? Or is this actually relevant to the debate? Or does the mechanism allow for this sort of point to be made in the debate? So you'll have this, and you won't have the whole thing in your head at the same time, right? This whole map, but you should have something around a map built out into what decisions you need to make in order to decide the debate. And here's the important rule, and this is true for chairing your wings, and this comes from the other workshop as well. Every single sentence is relevant to the debate absolutely if and only if you can draw the path from this sentence that is being said in the discussion back to the top of the debate. It's absolutely fine if I don't know, we're talking about the first comparison right now, I don't know what the whole tree and paths look like somewhere else. But if I'm saying, I think this point wasn't explained well enough, I have to be able to understand what this question is helping me answer comparatively, what this answer is helping me answer in a specific comparison, and that this comparison is going to be important in the rankings. I think a lot of people sort of know the situation where you start a discussion and then somebody says, you know what, I was really disappointed that they didn't talk about X, right? Which is something that we shouldn't do in judging in general, but The reason we shouldn't do this in judging, right? There's the point where we don't judge the debate about what we wanted, but again, the sort of more basic reason why we don't do that is because that's never going to, or almost never going to, be relevant in the path to making a decision that we want to make. The same thing goes for something that could be relevant, but we're just not in the point of the discussion where we can do that. So if we say, look, I want to say in the beginning that the point that they made, I think they didn't set out to prove what they were trying to prove. That's a relevant thing to say potentially, and that's something that could be useful in debate. But if you open the discussion and say that, chances are you haven't made the connection and know how that's going to connect. And I'm quite sure that the other people who weren't reading the debate in the same sort of way that you were reading the debate don't know how to connect it up. And so it's very hard to make that a relevant thing to say right at the beginning of the discussion. As the chair, you need to make sure that this happens as quickly as possible, because your wings aren't going to, and they're not expected to, have this whole thing and understand exactly where the discussion should go. The chair should have this more or less in their mind. So if we say the discussion starts, we get the rankings from the wings. We sort of understand what comparisons we want to make, and we sort of have a very basic idea about how much time we want to put into everything. We make the decision we want to start by comparing the two top half teams. Great, we already have sort of one step down in our tree. And now the question is, what are the major decisions that I'm going to need to make? And then usually through talking with the wings, figure out for these major comparisons, what are the areas that we want to talk about in order, what are sort of the minor disagreements that we want to talk about in order to make that major comparison. Now, it's absolutely fine to not know at the beginning of the debate what are the major comparisons. There are usually more than one way to look at a comparison between two teams and say, we can do this by clash, or we can say, there's one main line of argumentation, let's talk about the different ways that the other team attacked it, or they're trying to do sort of very different things, let's see the overlap, or let's see where they engage with each other. There are lots of different ways to make comparisons between two teams. If you're not sure how to do this, it's absolutely fine that the first thing you want to figure out is what those are. That is, by our definition, relevant in order to be able to making this decision, and therefore it's relevant in the discussion and the debate. And if you're not sure about that alone, it's definitely possible to do that with the help from your wings. The way that you do that with the help from your wings is asking them the very general questions, but the ones that lead them to going to that top comparison. Can somebody tell me why you thought that opening government was above opening op? Is a very good opening line, because it does exactly that. It means I don't have to at this point commit to what are sort of the major comparative decisions I want to make, but I'm getting information from my wings about what they thought they were. Okay? It could also be that I say, look, I think it's very obvious to all of us that opening government had sort of one big claim and everything rests around that. What do you think were the major areas in which opposition engaged with that main claim, or do you think they did something very different? That's a way to say, I'm not yet fully sure about how I want to make these decisions. Here's what I do know, help me do that. And if they cooperate in answering that question and not saying completely different things, they are now saying things that are relevant to figuring out what that map looks like, which is relevant in order to be able to walking through that map and that tree and getting to that decision. The one thing that's going to come back again and again in quite a few places about being a chair is when you're making decisions about how you want the discussion to go, and making decisions about how you want to guide the discussion, you have to be, or you should be, very, very explicit about what those decisions are and why you're doing them like you're doing them. So for instance, I start the debate, I make the decision to start with a comparison between top half. That's a good default if I don't have anything intelligent to do. If I say to one of the wings, why don't you tell me what you think the main points in opening government's case are, which is another fine way to talk about it if you're completely at loss of what's going on in this debate. Let's just start with what they said, right? If I already know that I'm making a comparison to opening opposition, that's very useful information for this person to know. Because a lot of times, depending on if they noticed where I'm in disagreement with them, they know that they rank closing government very differently from me. If they think we're making the government bench comparison, they might be sort of very focused on making sure to understand what exactly came from OG that would eventually come again later, which might not be that relevant for me right now. So letting them know which comparison I'm making is important, but it's not only that, it's why I'm making this comparison. Because saying, I think the top half is probably the most difficult and important decision we need to make. Let's start with that. Or, I think top half is relatively simple. We should be able to get through that quickly. Let's start there. Are very, very different things. And I expect a good wing to respond very differently to these sort of explanations. And I want the wing to understand what I'm looking to do in this debate. The same thing goes when we go deeper into the debate. So if I say, I want to hear now about how Op answered this point. That's a good start. This is being very explicit about what I want to talk about, what is sort of the non-comparative decision under the big comparative decision that hopefully we already talked about what it is that goes into. That's good. But I think it's even more important to explain sort of the reasoning behind this, right? So saying, look, if Op can't answer this, we already agreed that they're not going to be able to win this comparison. So do they have anything? Or if you say, look, this is probably a point where all of government's case hinges on. If Op can find a decent answer, then they easily won this debate. It's similar, but these are sort of very different logical places to be when I'm comparing these two teams. I want the people with me in the discussion to know it, and more importantly, I want them to agree with me about why we're talking about this thing so that we can all move forward and make that decision. The last thing about making sure that the discussion is relevant and talking about the things that you want to talk about is that generally, and we're going to talk specifically about what to do with problematic panel members later, but specifically, in most cases, you generally want to avoid conflict like the plague, both in what you talk about and in how you talk about it. You generally don't want to reach the point where the discussion is a discussion of A versus B, each one trying to get the result that they want. You want this to be a cooperative endeavor where everybody's trying to figure out what the call is. It might feel like those are just two different ways of saying the same thing, where one is nicer to say than the other, but they're genuinely very different if you're able to make it a cooperative work together. And I'll say a few things that I think sort of make that a real thing. Because there's obviously the, let's say, the parts about how I phrase things and how I talk about things, and they're important, right? So not going to someone and outright saying, look, you're wrong, here's why this is true, but I read it slightly differently, here's what I think. Or not slightly differently. I read it very differently. Here's what I think. Let's think through this. And this is words, right? This is me saying things in a nicer way to make people not feel as bad and therefore more likely to listen. And that's fine. It's not. I think that's not the main issue, but I think that's important as well. The main issue is that if you're coming into this not thinking, I know the answer, the other people don't. How do I get them past this? But if you're thinking, I have an answer, and maybe I'm very sure of it, right? It's fine to be 98% sure of your call. If you're more than 98% sure of your call, you're wrong. But it's fine to be 98% sure of your call. They have a different call. I don't know, maybe you do know, but I don't know if they're also 98% sure or if they're 30% sure, but they feel bad going back on what they already said, which is not a thing. People shouldn't, but it happens. I don't want to figure out how to get the other person to change their mind. I want to figure out how we can get a good answer to this question together. And that means creating a process which lets us fairly answer this question. And if I'm 98% sure, I'm also 98% sure that if I create a fair process, that'll work. What do I mean? I think probably the best example of it is, and this is, I don't do this in debate, I do this with people who would work under me on projects or at work, right? I give them the instructions as to what they need to do in order to change their mind, right? So at some point, once we've talked through a class for a while, I'll say, look, this is a really good piece of logic by this team that I think can win this debate. If you can show me a place where they make it irrelevant, or they significantly mitigate it, or they tell me why this is untrue, then I understand why they'll be able to win the debate. And depending on how much I need to explain this, right, so why that would be and why without it, it's very difficult to do. That's a fair thing. That's a commitment for me, if I'm being honest, right, to say that if they do show this, I will at least say, okay, I need to walk back at least a lot of what I've set up until now. But that's figuring out what would make this decision. It fits into our tree structure, right? I need to make this comparative decision. What would help me make that? Let's figure out how that works. If a wing will say, I think they proved this, and this is amazing. I think they proved that if you enact the death penalty, nobody will ever murder again, right? Because that's what they claimed, and I think they proved it. And I think like there was nothing of that sort in the speech, right? They said, oh, look, death is really scary. People won't murder. And then, like, fair enough, I don't think that would constitute a proof. I will say, here's what I have, right? I have this sentence, and I'll just go back to my notes and read them out, right? I'll have this sentence, and then this sentence, and then this sentence. Here's what I saw there. Are there significant links that I'm missing in this that would change the extent to which they proved it? And if they'll answer automatically, depending on the situation, I might actually say, just look back at your notes, right? Read them out to me. Let's see if there's something that you have that I don't. And then we'll either ask the other wing or not. And to be fair, when you're doing that, you are committing to an extent, assuming you're decently honest, that if they say, here are links, they are able to give them very specifically. And let's say the other wing in the room says, yes, I have those links as well, and then what they have lines up, that fair enough, that you made the wrong call. Creating this sort of process is a really, really good way to make the discussion relevant, and a really, really good way to make sure that the discussion doesn't devolve into conflict. I'm saying, here's how we make this decision, and assuming that they agree with that, and they usually will, because like being a wing a lot of times, especially when chairs are relatively dominant in the conversation, is usually about how is my chance to do something that's relevant to the discussion, to be able to contribute something when the chair sort of has a read of the whole debate. How can I contribute something that makes a difference? If I go and say, here's how you make a difference, people are usually very happy to take me up on that and then say, here's what I have there. And then it's much easier to not be at the point where we're in a conflict. We're in a point where, okay, let's see together if that's actually there. If that's actually there, that's great. And that also means, that I do want to be honest, try to help them figure that out, right? So let's see if they have anything more. I'll look in my notes. You look in your notes. Here's what I have. I have a little bit extra. I don't think that's going to be enough. Do you have anything more? Like, let's work together to try to figure this out. And then hopefully, that creates a situation where it's not a conflict. Actually, we're working together to figure out if they have enough. And it's fine if I am seriously so sure that we're not going to be enough, right? They were so far away. And then I look through my notes and I find this tiny thing. And like, I know that they're going to find another tiny thing, and that's never going to be enough. It's fine, let's do that together and look for it. Once in 50 debates, if I'm 98% sure, I'm going to be surprised. And that does happen. Yes?
What if after you state why it would take to change your mind, the response you get is returning to the things that make them not convinced, and rather than actually answering your own statement? Like, so wings do that sometimes.
Yeah. Wings definitely don't always agree. They don't have to agree, right, on the criteria that I wanted to say how we make this decision-making process. I think there are two situations, and they get sort of further into when we talk about sort of depending on how bad it is, problematic points, right? But there are situations where that's not problematic, right? There are situations where the wing is, maybe they're not explaining themselves correctly, but they say, I don't think this is a good way to make that decision. I want to make that decision through looking at another clash or another part. In which case, you do need to go back to the logic about how do we make the decision. And that's fair. I'm just going to add that to my decision tree. I'm just going to say, well, we want to make this decision and this decision, fair enough, but before that or after that, we need to make another decision about which criteria we prefer. And maybe that's a discussion we need to have. Is the thing that you want to talk about relevant to deciding the debate, or is the thing that I want to talk about, or do they both interact in some complex way? That's the good situation, right? The good situation is they might not be explaining themselves correctly, but what they really are trying to say is, I don't want to accept, I don't think I should accept this way of calling the comparison. I have a different way of calling the comparison. For instance, I think they made such an amazing point that might be relevant or not to the debate, that they should win the debate, period. That's my criteria for judging this debate. That doesn't sound like a good criteria to me, but that might be the criteria that they want. And that's not a bad situation, right? That's a situation where you can have a 30-second or 90-second discussion about what should be the right criteria to this debate, right? Is this enough? Let's give them this point. Does this point do enough in order to take the other things? If that depends on the other things, let's talk about the other things and sort of go through the logic as to why this is the right way to call this debate, or be convinced, right? Say, you know what? If that's what you think we should be talking about, let's talk about that, which it might work. In the cases where they're genuinely unwilling to talk about the relevant things, we'll talk about that in a little bit. Let's move to talking about problematic wings. And just to be clear, when I say problematic wings, I don't have any problem with them as people, just usually as adjudicators. And a lot of judges can be very good in some things and then awful in other things, or very good in some contexts. Let's say when they judge in the way that people generally judge in their debate circuit, but that doesn't mesh well with your judging style. It can definitely be that, and we've seen that a lot, where some people have an amazing experience with a specific judge, and some people have a terrible experience with that same judge, and they're both very similar judges even. But in the end, you reach the point where you are now within the discussion, and you feel that you're unable to progress through the progress that you need to make when you're thinking about time, or through the decision tree about what you want to do. And at this point, this wing is obstructing my ability to have a call that we're all happy with at the end of the debate. And so when I say problematic wing, I mean strictly within the context of what's happening now. I don't think we should be making judgment calls on human beings based on the sort of very, very random thing called adjudicating debates. And so the first thing is, obviously, they exist. There's no magic solution where, look, if you're just scary enough, then they'll all be afraid and not be problematic. Being scary can help with some of them and can be very detrimental with others. Being very nice can help with some of them and can be detrimental with others. Being sort of very methodical about how you go through these, through the debate and the discussion, can help with a lot of them and then be detrimental with others. So there's no like one good thing. Look, if you do this, then it will happen. I will say that I think there are a lot of both sort of stylistic things about being, at least having some base amount of confidence level, and coming into the debate and sort of knowing the direction that you want to take the debate. That really helps reduce the amount of things that turn into something that's problematic. So a lot of people can be very helpful in discussion, but don't really know what they should be talking about. And if you come into the discussion with some amount of confidence and put that up on the table, here's what I think we should be talking about, there will be great wings. But then if you don't do that and you let things sort of, well, I'm not sure what we should be doing, let's see what you thought was interesting, and sort of not give any sort of guidance or be very inconfident about what you're doing, then I think some people turn into something more problematic within the context of that specific debate. So I think there's sort of a base level where if you become more competent, you do apparently have, like at least think you have better wings than you would otherwise. The first basic things I'll say about dealing with problematic situations is sort of the easy basic principle, and then let's talk about sort of more specifics. The sort of easy thing in the beginning is you really want to figure out who is problematic potentially and in what way as soon as possible. It's really useful to, if you have the chance, take a few minutes to talk to them before the debate starts. Sort of see, are we communicating well? Do I understand what this person is saying? Or are they talking like in a confused manner and I'm just not having an easy time communicating? Does this person act towards me as if they think they're such a better adjudicator than I am, that this might be an issue that comes up? Is this someone who, as soon as we start talking, starts saying how their last chair was so awful and what they did wrong, and when I listen to that I say, well, that doesn't sound so bad. That sounds like what a chair could do in a reasonable circumstance. So try to have a chance to see as quickly as possible. That also goes in the beginning of the discussion. So give your wings a chance to speak relatively early. See what they're thinking about. The really bad cases usually show themselves very quickly as soon as you let somebody speak. And you want to know that as early as possible. If you use up, we're talking about time, right? A minute and a half out of your 4 to 5 minutes of speaking, talking about what I think this debate should look like. And because you think that's useful. And then you figure out that there's a wing who's literally going to make it very hard for you to get another word out of your mouth through this whole discussion. Maybe that was a waste of a minute and a half. So you want to figure that out as early as possible. Do keep in mind, if you do that, people can be surprising. Some people talk in a very confused and sort of very talk about lots of different things when you talk to them before the debate starts, and then when they actually get to adjudicating a debate, they're very, very straightforward. So give yourself a chance to be pleasantly surprised if you think something might be worrying, but definitely try to figure it out as early as possible. Now, in general, there are two ways. Every problematic wing is unique, but in general, there are two ways in which wings can be problematic. Which the first one is they might be obstructing the discussion. They might be making it difficult for you to have a good discussion, or they just might be very bad adjudicators. One of them is their ability to understand the debate. One of them is their ability to cooperate in the conversation. Let's talk about them one by one. Firstly, if you're looking at a wing that is obstructing the discussion, so they may be not letting other people speak, or they may be only wanting to speak about things that they find are interesting, or they might be constantly going to talk about things that are not really relevant, or they might be having to make very small comments about every little thing that happens in discussion. That just makes it difficult for everyone to sort of figure out what we want to talk about. The first decision you need to make. So in general, obstructing discussion is probably the more severe one. We'll talk about why in a bit, but obstructing discussion is usually the more severe one. But still, the first decision you want to make is, do I actually have to do anything about this? A lot of times, people will be very uncooperative, but it will not eat into the time that you want to speak and the time that the other wings want to speak. And they just want to be incredibly unhelpful with the 2 to 3 minutes that they have to speak. And fair enough, it might be the best thing for me to do to let them speak about nearly random things or things that are actively away from what we want to talk about. Reply to that with about 10 seconds of, yes, that's very interesting, but I'd like to hear what you want to say about the thing that we're actually talking about. And we've wasted 2 to 3 minutes of our time because this person isn't going to say things that are usually helpful, but it might genuinely be in some cases more helpful to do that than to actually try to make that sort of conversation about, let's try to get you to talk about the things that we want to talk about, which will not only cost their speaking time, also cost my speaking time, and will also possibly cut into the other person, because that becomes a thing, right? When I say, I want you to talk about this, why this is really important. So depending on the person and the situation, it might be that you're okay with saying, look, this person wants to make their contributions about things that I think are unimportant. Fair. Assuming you do want to do something about it, you should always keep in mind there's a trade-off in most cases between doing something that's a relatively strong way of influencing someone, so being impolite or being very direct and saying, I want you to talk about this, or you keep talking about things that are relevant, or you keep cutting me off, in which it might be effective in the sense that it gets through to the person, but it also becomes ineffective in the sense that it increases the chance that this will now become a thing, and now we have to talk about the issues. And I'm all for if you can have a pleasant conversation and talk about the issues after 15 minutes of discussion are up. But during those 15 minutes of discussion, there's no real time to have a good way to work through people's issues in obstructing the conversation. So my main goal is to be able to get back to a good or even decent conversation. And there's always going to be the trade-off. If I can do something that's sort of very nuanced and gentle and not very strong, there's not a big chance of making this an issue. But then, does it work? And so what I'll do in general is I'll just escalate the strength of what I do over the course of 3 to 4 minutes. So I'll start with a sort of a very general thing. Just being slightly more assertive about what I want, talking a little bit more about the meta of what decisions I want to talk about, right? So if somebody's cutting people off, just being, okay, thank you, maybe slightly earlier than I would otherwise. I'd like to hear from you now. Or if somebody's not talking about the important things, yes, that's really interesting. What about this? So just being a little bit more assertive in how I guide the discussion. And sometimes that helps. Sometimes even people who are sort of way off, and that helps. It doesn't usually help, but again, that will be, there's no chance that we'll go into an issue. The next thing is, I'll try to be very active in guiding the conversation. So get to the point where, say, I'll be active enough that people do get my permission in order to speak. So as soon as somebody finishes, I'll go to the next and say, okay, do you want to say anything about it? And then as soon as they finish, do you want to say anything about it? And then if I do that sort of actively enough, then the wings will figure it out and say, okay, I want to say something next, and will either raise their hand or give me some sort of signal. And that allows me to guide the conversation a lot more easily. And so again, there's a small chance that this becomes an issue. That, wait, you're not letting me speak, and that's an issue. But if I do that fairly and sort of gently enough, that usually doesn't, and it solves a whole lot of the problems. If I need to escalate further than that, so somebody's obstructing to the extent that I'm doing this, and it's still a difficult conversation, usually that'll be the point where I will actually, very politely and slightly indirectly, request that they stop doing whatever it is they're doing. So it'll either say, I understand that you think this is really interesting. I'd really like to right now talk about this, and we'll try to get to that later if we have the time, right? It's direct. That can become an issue for sure, but that is, again, a sort of stronger way to hopefully make the person back down. Or, listen, this is all really interesting, but I'm not getting a chance to finish what I want to say. Could you please wait 10 seconds, let me finish the sentence, and then come in, right? And then this is quite direct, but it's all polite. There's not going to be you are X, right? There's not going to be you are obstructing. There's never going to be a situation where I'm being impolite. I'm always going to be polite, but I am going to be sort of very, anybody who understands the tone of my voice will figure out that at this point I'm unhappy. If that doesn't work, and that should be rare, so this politely asking someone, but directly asking someone to stop doing what they're doing will generally almost always work. It definitely sometimes doesn't work. At the point where it doesn't work is usually a failure mode. If I ask somebody to stop cutting people off and they don't stop cutting people off, if I ask someone to not steer the conversation constantly away from places where we want to and they're still not doing it, we've moved into sort of discussion failure mode. I now want to salvage whatever it is I can and have some sort of discussion. And at that point, I will generally use pretty much any power that I have in guiding the conversation to steal 30 seconds or a minute of relevant discussion within whatever the hell is going on. Because this is going to be a situation where it's very difficult to get usually 3 or 4 back and forth of relevant discussion. I think probably an example that I remember very well, which will lead into the next point pretty well, is I was judging a room where the debate itself was incredibly complex and difficult because a lot of the teams screwed up. So again, there was a sort of but not really formal challenge to the definition made by not the leader of opposition, but the deputy leader of opposition. The problem is that the definition was absolutely illegal, and sort of, well, opening government did something that I'm not sure how I should credit, opening opposition did something that I'm not sure how I should credit, and closing half teams were confused as well. Opening that discussion, I looked at both of my wings and I said, especially because of what happened in the top half, I think this is going to be confusing. We're going to have to be very efficient in going through all of the things in order to be able to get through all the things that we want to do. I'll ask that you really try to be focused on the specific questions that we're going to be asking throughout every stage of this conversation. One of the wings got that completely and also did very well throughout the conversation. The other turned out, unfortunately, to be a person who literally had never stopped speaking throughout 15 or 20 minutes of conversation without me loudly talking over it. So they would say, the answer that they had to me saying this is complex, please be focused, was, I just have one small thing to say before we start. And they started talking, and after 20 or 30 seconds, I started making faces that that person should stop talking, and after a few more seconds, I said, okay, and that person kept talking, and after that, I talked over them, and they kept talking, and then I talked over them loudly, and then they stopped. And in the 5 or 6 more times that they had the ability to speak throughout those 15 minutes, they had never stopped talking without me getting to the point where I loudly talk over them. In that sort of situation, and I did get to the point where I request that they stop talking at some point, and that didn't work. At that point, I'm looking at the other wing, and whenever I can get 30 to 40 seconds of uninterrupted back and forth, that's a good thing to get. And then I'm at the point where I try to take control as much as I can, so I will say, at some point, I will just talk over the other person to get the conversation back to me. That's great. Here's what I think. What do you think? They start talking. I loudly say, no, just wait a second. I'm listening to the other person thing, and I'm not going to stop talking because they won't unless I do. Yes, please keep going. And I create this island of decent conversation within the chaos. And so after requesting somebody stop doing what they're doing, and that doesn't work, I usually just go into failure mode and figure out how many seconds of conversation or minutes of conversation I can create that actually works. This does go into the next point when you have somebody who's obstructing the discussion in a major way, which is you want to be, as a chair, very, very aware of the wings that are cooperative in this discussion. So usually, when somebody is obstructing the discussion in a major way, that means your discussion effectively becomes shorter. Like it just means you have less time to talk about things you do. So you want to make that count. So when this person is talking about relatively irrelevant things, I'm a good deal of the time looking at the other wings. Because sometimes they'll touch on something relevant, and I want to see if they nod or they make a face that they disagree, because I want to get any sort of back-channel discussion with the other wings who are actually doing things that are helpful. I want to get a chance to say the things that I think are important and give the other wings a chance to say what they want to talk about or what they disagree with, because we're not going to be able to go over all of the questions that I think we should go over. So let's figure out what they want to talk about or what they disagree with. A lot of times it'll actually be usually with signals and not so much words, trying to actually get their cooperation, right? So usually in these situations where there's a major obstruction, right, everybody will be slightly frustrated, and then actually working with the other wings into, okay, now you have a chance, what is the most important thing? And they understand when I say what is the most important thing, that we're not going to get to all of the things that we want to talk about and get through that. The specific case where I told you about where somebody wouldn't stop talking ever, that was literally like the other wing there was just giving me like eye signals and hand signals about what they agree and disagree with to be able to move some of the discussion forward. I was incredibly impressed with the level of nonverbal communication that we could get while we didn't have time to actually say anything to a large extent. Last thing about people who are obstructing the discussion, obviously, if you're not going to get to talk about all the things that you need to talk about, you have to be, even more than usual, always aware of, if you take a vote on any specific ranking, where would that vote end up? I think it's usually important to think through that when you're deciding what comparisons you want to do. Usually, as the chair, you'll want to move quickly, not always first, but quickly towards the discussions where you're in the minority, because those are the ones that, if you're wrong, you want to talk about. If you're right, you want to have that be the decision. But if you're, for whatever reason, discussion is becoming shorter, you need to be much, much more aware of that and make a beeline, like even we haven't made a decision about this comparison. I realize that I'm not going to have another 10 minutes of effective discussion. I'm going to have another 4. Let's put this comparison aside. Let's talk about this one because I think it's more important. And that's something that I wouldn't do a lot, but I would do if my effective discussion time just got shortened from 10 to 4 minutes. And yeah, probably the absolute last thing about people who are obstructing discussion, because it's pretty much absolute suffering for 15 to 20 minutes, is go and talk to other people about how bad your experience was. It helps to get some of it off your chest after having an absolutely awful discussion. Second type is wings who are just bad adjudicators or just making a very wrong call on this debate. And the reason it's usually not as big a deal is that if you can guide the conversation the way you want it, you have a lot of tools in your disposal to get through that and either turn them or make sure that the eventual vote goes in your favor. But the first thing I will say about what you need to think about when you see either one wing or all of your wings give an absolutely wrong call, or see something that makes no sense to you, is that you should absolutely be aware of the Dunningkruger effect. And if you're not aware of the Dunningkruger effect, then Google it. If you misspell it, Google will help you. It's a really, really interesting thing to read about, which in the bottom line, after a lot of interesting discussion that I'm not going to go into, means that there's an incredibly large chance that you think you're a better adjudicator than you really are. That goes to everyone who's listening to this. You will make more mistakes than you think you will make. You will think people are worse adjudicators than you, while in fact they are better than you. And so getting to the point where I say, this is a very bad adjudicator, I need to figure out how to deal with it, it's something that you should always be at least partially humble in your own mind about. It's likely that this person is also thinking, what a terrible chair with a bad call I have. And that situation is not something that's always easy to know who is right. To be fair, everyone, including the absolute best judges in the world, make mistakes. Not a tiny amount of mistakes, so make mistakes once in a while. And the tragically interesting thing about mistakes is that you don't know which those are. So even if I know that I might miss the call in 1 out of 10 debates, I will still think I have the right call during that 1 out of 10 debates. So you don't have a good way of knowing when you're wrong, and you need to keep that in the back of your head, and that works into creating sort of a fair decision-making process, as we talked about before. When you think that you have a wing that is making a very bad call, either in the rankings or in something that goes into the rankings, there are 2 big questions you need to ask yourself that will determine what sort of tools you use in order to move forward the discussion. The first question is the misunderstanding or is the difference in opinion between you an opinion about facts or rules of debating, that is, something where there is legitimate proof about which of you is correct, which you can find, or whether there is a difference in judgment call or opinion or how you understand something, whereas a thing where it's a matter of discussion. That is the first big thing, and literally there should not be a case where you have a difference of opinion, where you don't have in the back of your head, it is either an opinion, our opinions about a fact that we can figure out, or about something that we need to keep talking about. Obviously, when it is a fact about, say, rules of debating, or a fact about real life that you, let's say, both agree that the average intelligent voter should know, just apparently one of you doesn't, which happens, what you should be doing is figuring out that fact and not talking about why that would be true. Like, don't get into the understandable habit of debating about things, okay? I usually recommend, especially on new chairs, but I also try to do that with me, to have on your phone or somewhere accessible the briefing that the CA team sent before this tournament. I would also recommend, especially to new chairs or new judges who haven't done this a few times in the past, to go over that briefing and at the very least know where you will find rules about different things. right? So you believe that the fact that somebody, let's say, the fact that somebody had a very bad style should not directly affect their speaker points, and somebody who is more comfortable with other forms of debating thinks that it should. That is in the briefing. If you know where to find it in the briefing, that'll literally take you 20 seconds, and you're done with this discussion, unless you also have somebody who's obstructing the discussion, which does happen that you get the double whammy of bad adjudicator and obstructing the discussion. But the vast majority of cases, you open the briefing, and then even if the person thinks, well, nobody listens to the briefing, as soon as you say, look, this is the briefing, this is what we do, that will be the end of that discussion. If you don't know where to find it within the briefing, it might be unrealistic to find it because those briefings are quite long. So bring on your phone or someplace where you have access to the briefing and familiarize yourself enough to be able to find things quickly with it. The same thing is true for questions like, did or did they not say something, okay? You should have in your notes enough about not only, and I see some people who take notes that are sort of very, very light, right? This is the main point of the discussion. Here are the main title of the point. Here is the sort of two big sentences within it, and then let's say a check mark or X, depending on whether I think that's good or not. But that's just not good enough, right? Because eventually they'll say, did they actually say this very specific but important detail? You want to be able to say, here's what I have, sentence above this, sentence including this detail, sentence afterwards. And that is decent proof that you're not just misremembering. If they think they said something, then again, I'll usually start with my notes because I know I keep good enough notes and I don't know how well the wing is keeping notes. Here's what I have, sentence before, sentence without this detail, sentence after. What do you have, right? We're going to the thing that we can actually fact check to see who's correct. If we're not in a situation where we can fact check to see who's correct, then I'm going back to a fair process and I'm saying, we need to find a way to agree on a process to make this decision. So if we say, I think they had this point, which is really good, you think they had this point, you start with agreeing about what is the question. We want to know which of these points is more important in this debate. Or we want to know whether one of these points defeats the other. Or we want to know about whether any team mitigated the other team's point to a large enough extent to win this debate. But you want to start with an agreement. You don't go straight till the end to say, I think this wins because it's better, you think this wins because it's better. You always want to take a step back and say, what is the criterion we're going to use to make this judgment call? Once you agree on this criterion, how do we make this call? So let's say a simple case would be two back half teams, both had a good extension, both had very little engagement. They thought this team's, one team's extension was better, you thought the other team's extension was better. There's a judgment call there. You're not going to be able to find whether the extension was better in your notes. And then depending on the situation, you can say, since they both have relatively unengaged with extensions, let's see whether one of them did manage to, if we go and look over our notes carefully, mitigate to a decent extent the extension of the other team. And that would be a good way to give them the win. And that's something that's usually agreeable. Not always, but that's usually agreeable. And then you both go over your notes and you find that. And once you do that, it's much easier to agree because you went through this process together. And because you didn't rush to the end, right? You made a decision that you agree with on how you're going to make that decision. The second question that you need to ask about wings who are not making correct calls or just bad at adjudicating is, are they actually open to persuasion? Keep in mind, the fact that a wing has not been persuaded yet does not mean that they're not open to persuasion. But sometimes you can tell by the way that the person is speaking or the extent to which you think they're responding or listening that they're not really open to extension. Again, that changes the tools that you're going to use quite a lot. In the bad case, where they're not open to persuasion, I would almost always, before making the final call, where, like, in my mind, I make that decision, look, this person is not listening to me, I'm done. I will almost always try to give them the best chance they have to at least show me that they're responding to what I'm saying. So I will take a step back, right? Say, I understand what you're saying. Here is your logic. Listen to why I think this logic still doesn't work. Here is where I attack it. Do you understand why I think this is the case? I won't even ask them to respond. I say, do you understand why I think this is the case? It's usually my format to say, like, I'm currently thinking that you're not even listening to me. Prove to me that you are, or give me some sign that you are. If that person says, yes, I understand, and is able to say 2 or 3 words that makes me think that you're actually listening to me, I will walk back my decision and say, okay, this person is listening. Maybe I needed to get to that level of explicitness to get them to understand, and I'll keep talking at that level of being very, very explicit, or maybe slightly reduce it with some time. But if, if I'm already at the point where I think this person isn't listening, I will say, do you understand? And they will say, yes, but, and talk about their thing again. That is usually a very good sign that they're just not listening. Like they didn't give me even 2 words before the but. I want to talk about my thing again. If we're at that point, then this becomes a discussion that the main goal of it is the other people, right? So I will sometimes answer this person, but kind of like when you give a POI, you still look at the adjudicators and not actually the other team. I'm going to talk and look at the other people in the room. I'm going to count their vote to whatever they are on now, and I'm going to talk to try to explain and persuade the other people in the room. I'll also, at this point, whenever I'm making these sort of meta decisions about what criteria do we use to judge it, what process we do in order to make a decision, I will make that process with the other ones in the room. Like there's no point engaging. I'll be polite. I'll always be polite. I'll always listen to the person when they're speaking. I'll always respond to them to the extent that what they say need a response. I don't think there's unless someone is being very rude, and not being open to persuasion isn't being rude, right? Like unless somebody's being very rude, there's never a point to not be decently polite to a person, but they're not in my focus at this point in the discussion. When a person is willing to be persuaded, and keep in mind that we also have the answer to whether this is a fact or a judgment call, there are a few things that I think are important to remember. The first thing is, in a lot of debates, it's much, much easier to go into the other person's point of view and explain it from there than to persuade them to come over to your point of view. So usually, my first attempt will be to say, here's how I see this clash. Maybe not the first thing I say, but what I'll try to say is I try to have the discussion on the terms that I think are the most intuitive terms to talk about something, right? So I think that they have one big point, and if the other team doesn't answer it, then they've probably lost. Or I think there are 3 clashes, here are the clashes, let's talk about them. Sometimes somebody won't see it that way, that won't be intuitive to them. In this case, what I'll do is, a lot of the times, I'll just try to jump into their point of view. So they think, I think we should be talking about the answers that Op gave to this government's point. They look at it the other way around. They think there are 2 big clashes, and we need to talk about this clash because this is the important one. A lot of times it's just easier for me to jump into that point. And a lot of times, especially if the difference between the teams is very large, then no matter what point of view you use, the answer will still be the same. So in those cases, we say, well, first government obviously beats first opposition. The difference between these 2 teams is huge. I don't mind. Like, let's talk about it through whatever lens you want. If the difference was large enough, they're going to win through that lens as well. And so I'll make that step. Okay, let's talk about this. You think this is the main point for opposition. Here are the 3 different answers that government give to them. And that's not the way that I wanted to look at this debate, but it's good enough. The nice thing about this is that when the difference is very large, then it works very well. When the difference isn't very large, that's usually a case where you really should be more unsure about whether this is correct. So if you jump into their point of view and you can't easily articulate why even within this point of view your team won, that doesn't mean that your team really did win, but that at least gives you some question marks about whether you should be thinking through this point of view, at least to some extent. Last thing about problematic wings in general. It is incredibly useful to, at every single point in the discussion, both within your mental state and outwards, to remain calm. To not become agitated, to not become rude, to not start moving from one thing to another and showing that you're not sure what you should be talking about, to not become angry. Somebody is saying things that are completely irrelevant and is completely refusing to talk about anything that's relevant to the debate. Okay. Take 10 seconds, pause, think through what you should be saying next, and then figure out and say, thank you, that's really interesting. I still disagree. I'd love to hear what you want to say about this. Just the fact that outwardly you are seemingly in control of the conversation, and with some degree of confidence, you are able to say, okay, now I want to do this, makes it so much easier to get some of what you want out of the conversation, be that getting the votes to go your way, or be that to have a discussion about the things that you want to discuss. Specifically, in cases where you have multiple problematic things, which can be problematic in very different ways, which are generally probably the worst discussions in the world, a lot of the times you won't be able to have very meaningful discussions about a lot of the things. And a lot of the times when you have multiple bad wings, then a lot of them simply don't understand a lot about the debate to make meaningful decisions, and you haven't had a lot of meaningful discussion. A lot of the votes will be affected by confidence and by how much you can show that I know what I'm talking about. Here's how this discussion should go. I understand what you're saying, but that's still incorrect and irrelevant to the debate. And that affects people who haven't had a meaningful discussion about the things that they should be using to judge this debate. So, especially in cases where everything is going to hell, that is the most important case to stay calm, keep as much as you can control the discussion, and don't show on the outside, and hopefully don't feel too much on the inside, how awful a time it is that you're having. We are moving on from panel discussion to talking to the debaters at the end, so giving rankings and feedback. I think this is probably a good time to take a 5-minute break and then come back afterwards. So, see you soon. So, while we had the break, I had two really interesting questions. One that relates to what we talked about, one that relates to something I was going to talk about, but I think this is probably a good time to talk about. So I'll go into those. One which is, I think, is just a good specific example of the gray areas of these sort of decisions that I was telling you to ask, like, is this a fact-based thing or is this a judgment call? So this was the case of somebody who's judging with a top-breaking judge in euros or worlds or whatever it is, and they eventually reached in the discussion the situation where one team had considerable logical gaps in their case, and this wing was actually a very experienced judge, says it's true that they had large logical gaps, but their case was much more intuitive, and therefore I think that should be it. And I think it's an interesting situation where you shouldn't be saying, intuitive is a good thing in and of itself, and therefore this wins the debate. I think, not seeing the debate, I don't know what the actual call is, but that doesn't seem to me like a good justification to prefer the team with a more intuitive case. And the thing I would say is two things. Firstly, there's a good chance that maybe 40 or 50% of briefings would have a part in them, if you're familiar enough with them, that would help you knock down this sort of intuitive case, therefore better case explanation. And that is the part in the briefing that would say that you shouldn't use proxies for persuasion, like being novel or funny or interesting. I think if you're familiar enough with the briefing and what it looks like, you'll remember whether this year's briefing has it in it. And if it is, that might not work, but I think that is the part in the briefing that addresses these sort of things, where I say, look, being intuitive is an interesting proxy for persuasion. It's something that goes into persuasion, but in the end, if they didn't do the job of actually persuading us through use of logic as we do in debate, then their case is probably still not strong enough. To be fair, in this situation, we are looking at a much more experienced wing than you are as a judge in general. That might not work. Like some people might not listen. But I think that would be probably my best attempt at trying to do that. The other thing, and it came from this question, and this is a part where I was going to do in the end, but we might as well do it now because it relates very well to this question, and thinking about it again, it might have been best in the beginning, starts from the question of what do you do if you have wings who are just much more experienced than you? And sometimes that happens. Sometimes they'll put a very new chair in a very high room, and then to sort of look over them or make sure that everything is okay, they'll put just a much more experienced judge as a wing. And going into that, I'll say there are very different styles of chairing. And you should have some range at least. You have probably some sort of preference, but you should have some range to deal with slightly different situations in panels. For instance, even very experienced adjudicators usually chair very differently between in rounds. Well, if they're a very experienced chair, they will usually have relatively inexperienced wings, or even somewhat experienced. Or if they're chairing a semifinal or final of Euros or Worlds, where usually everyone in this room will be very experienced adjudicators. And so the sort of parameters that you should be thinking about when you're thinking about chairing style, I think there are a few, right? So first one is, how active are you in the conversation in giving your own opinions, right, on the debate? So a lot of times, even for me, if we're talking about in rounds where I will be the most experienced adjudicator in the panel, I will usually be relatively active. So I might, in the beginning of every comparison, ask the other wings what they thought first, but then after they would say, I would just come in with my opinion and say, here's what I think. Let's start there, or let's start between where we are. If I'm chairing an out round, a lot of times I'll also always say my opinion, just so that people in the room have an idea about where the votes lie. I think that's useful for everybody to be relevant in the conversation. But I might, unless I think there's a good reason to, stay back with my specific opinions, let the discussion go, and then only come in if I think either it's going in the direction that I think is possibly very wrong, or if I think there's something very useful to say that I think would be very helpful in discussion. If there are 4 other very experienced adjudicators that are having a good discussion, I might not think it's needed a 5th voice in this discussion regarding their opinions. Another thing might be how active you are in guiding the discussion technically, so who gets to speak. In this situation, a lot of times it's the other way around for me. So a lot of times when I have just 2 more wings with me, I don't need to guide the discussion a lot. Everybody, if they're not obstructing, right, everybody can speak when they want to speak, and it works pretty well. When you have 5 experienced adjudicators in the panel, a lot of times it's just very useful that people raise their hand when they want to speak, and you go 1, 2, 3, go. At the end of that, okay, 1, 2, 3, and they go. That's especially true when you're chairing, let's say, finals with sometimes 9 adjudicators. There's just no way that people can sort of intuitively talk when they should be talking, and then you just, as a chair, possibly your main role, they don't need more opinions about what's going on. What they need is somebody to make sure that people are speaking in an orderly fashion. And that's usually most of what I'll do, unless something very wrong is going on in the discussion. I'll say, wait, I need to talk about this for a minute. Another thing that might be different between different chairing styles is how much you guide the discussion to talk about specific things, or how much you react to what the wings want to do. And this will, a lot of times, just depend on how sure I am about whether I have a specific way that I want to look at this comparison, or how sure the wings look about what they want to talk about. So sometimes I'll say, let's say I'm in the minority of this specific comparison. Let me tell you how I read this, and then you tell me where you disagree. And then I took control about how we speak about this comparison. And sometimes I'll even give that specific power to one of the wings. You're in the minority right now. Why don't you tell us how you read this, and then we can react to you. So whether I want to react or whether I want to sort of guide or decide where we talk about. And another thing about style that's very important is when somebody says something that's wrong, whether you sort of immediately jump in, even if it's in the middle, and sort of signal to them, this is something we'll need to talk about because I disagree with this, or whether you sort of let them finish the whole thing and then say, okay, there are 3 things that I think we need to talk about, 1, 2, 3. It's sort of a stylistic difference. I think a lot of the cases I talked in the example about the difference between chairing an in-round and an out-round, but I think a lot of the same thing happens when you're chairing just with more experienced adjudicators as your wings. I think a lot of the times, if people are more experienced, you do take a bit of a step back, give them a bit more room to speak and to possibly even guide the conversation, and then come in with the things that you think are useful and important. Now keep in mind, don't effectively relinquish chairing. Okay, so don't say, I'm not sure what we should be talking about, what do you think we should be talking about? Because at this point, you're not doing your job. Like, fair, it can be a good discussion, maybe they're a better chair than you, right? But you're not doing your job that was given to you to be the chair of this debate. Do what you would do normally. I think we should start talking about this comparison. Why don't you tell us why you think A is over B? You can do that to, let's say, the less experienced wing that you have, or the more experienced. They're both fine. You still do a job in guiding the discussion, but you give them more room to have a say about how you want to speak. Eventually, chairing people who are more experienced than you is difficult and sometimes like can genuinely and truthfully make you somewhat nervous. A lot of people who are very experienced don't listen so much to opinions of people who they think aren't as experienced as them. That's on them, and that sucks. And that means that they don't improve as much as they could. But be humble in the sense that give them the space to talk about the things that they want to talk about, because fair, they earned it to an extent, but keep doing your job. Keep guiding the discussion, keep making sure that you're looking at the time and you're looking at the decision tree and you're eventually getting to where you want to get to. Amend your style by degrees. Yes?
What if a more experienced wing tries to give themselves the authority of the chair within the ground?
So, I think there are two things that can happen. One of them is pretty much okay, and one of them is not okay, but that doesn't mean that you can do anything about it, right? So the thing that's okay is, it might be that this person just talks a lot, right? It could be that you have a chair who's relatively inexperienced, two wings, one of them very experienced, and that wing just talks more than they would otherwise. If I said like an average chair would talk twice as much as the other person, it might be that this chair is effectively talking twice as much as the other person, or even about as much or more than the chair. I think that's generally okay, right? I think if they're still cooperative in their discussion, if they just talk more and they give their opinion more, and they're even possibly more dominant in the discussion by that, but they're cooperative in general, I think that's fine, right? That's a dynamic that happens, and dynamics aren't always symmetrical between people, and that can happen when their experience is not symmetrical. At the point where they're not cooperative to you being the chair, that is, they say, no, I'd rather we talk about this, right? I would look at it in sort of two very different situations. One is, what would I do if this was an inexperienced wing doing that same thing? A lot of times I would cooperate with that. So a lot of times I'll have, not a lot of times, but sometimes I'll say, let's start with this comparison. And a wing who might not be very experienced, say, I'd really rather start talking about this, or I think we should be talking about this. And a lot of times, that's fine. Like if you want to do that, that's okay. I think to the extent that you would cooperate someone without being under the sort of nervous tension of this being a very experienced person, I think it's fine to cooperate to the extent that you would. At the point where you wouldn't cooperate, and at the point where this person is trying to sort of take away chair authorities, I think it's probably a good idea to put some force back, to say, look, we'll get to that. I think we should be starting here. And when you're the chair and you say, I think we should be starting here, it's okay that the next words are actually starting here, right? So let's talk about this. You don't have to wait for a response. I would put some force there. At the point where that small, polite amount of force like literally doesn't work, like I said, I get that, but I think we should, like just being the chair, right, doing what I told you as the chair to do, right? So I get that, but I think we should start here and then start talking about that. To be fair, I would prefer not getting into the conflict, letting this person do what they want, and then reporting him to the CA team of being just a terrible and like the CA team understands these things, right? They say like, look, he's more experienced than me, I get it, but effectively they didn't allow me to chair. Like fair enough, CA team knows that, and CA teams don't like it. Like it's not something that they would expect to happen. So somebody's being like genuinely that uncooperative, I wouldn't get into the situation. If it's somebody, and here's probably where I make the difference between somebody who's experienced and inexperienced, right? If somebody who's inexperienced, should not be chair, comes and tries to be the chair, I think they're just confused about what they're doing. I think they just don't understand what the discussion should look like. And then I'll probably use more force to make sure the discussion goes like that. If somebody who has been chair a lot of times, who's more experienced than me, takes that, I don't think they're confused. I think they're just making the decision to be assholes. In this case, I'm like, fine, you want to be an asshole, be an asshole. I'll just go and tell the C18 that you're an asshole. Like, I just wouldn't get into that. It is exceedingly rare. I think people who are experienced, who are not listening to you, or being more dominant, or talking more, or being very confident, or talking directly to the wings to persuade them, I think that happens. But I think people who are like actively taking the chair away from you, I think that's something quite rare. Let's talk about talking to the debaters after a debate. We'll start with giving the rankings, and then we'll talk probably a bit more about giving personal feedback. Firstly, when you talk about the rankings, and this again is especially relevant for new chairs or people who aren't confident, or even people who aren't fully confident with their calls. There's a huge difference between saying, this was a close call, I think this could go either way, we've decided to do this, and showing that you are unsure of the call that you've made with the process that you've made. It's fine to say, this is a very close call. I could imagine if we had another 15, 20 minutes to talk, that might flip. But we've had a discussion, we've had a good discussion or an okay discussion, and this is the decision that we've come to. And I'm happy and confident in this decision as the decision that we came to. And showing that you're very unsure, right? And usually with sort of a speaking style, or saying, well, I don't really know, I guess we had to give it to them. And showing that you don't have the confidence in the process that you've done and the decision that you've come to. There are two really important things to say about that. If at the end of a debate, the call was very close, you had a decent discussion, and you gave it to team A over B, turns out you were wrong in the end, right? After an hour speaking with the world's best judges, turns out you were wrong. Team B has nothing to complain about, okay? Like, to be fair, if they would have done a better job, it would have been more obvious. If they would have been better by enough of a degree, it would have been more obvious. If they would have been able to speak better so the judges understand why they win in a way that's more obvious, they would have won the debate. Debate is an activity that has variance in its judging and has a limited amount of time to make the discussion. The decision that you made to is an okay decision if you had a decent process in reaching it. That means that it's okay to be not fully sure of your decision, but feel confident in giving that decision to the teams. If you go to the wrong side of this, being unsure or not being confident or showing that you don't feel right with the decision that you gave, literally everyone loses. The team who was above, who got the first or got a better position than the other team, doesn't feel as good about being first. The team who was below now feels a lot more frustrated because having a bad round or even not agreeing with the judging happens, but being like, oh, it could have been the other way around. The judge was like not liking your judges and feeling like you got a lower position by randomness is not better, it doesn't feel any better than just losing a round. And you look much, much worse as a judge. Like it is actually one of the things that causes people to have as little confidence as you can cause people to have you as a judge, just because you're saying, well, I don't know, like this is what I had. It's okay to say calls were close. It's okay to say they might have been the other way around, but end the discussion with enough confidence to go to you and say, this is our call, this is the process that we had, this is the ranking at the end of this debate. And by the way, it's fine, just as sort of an extension of that. If a team then comes and says that they think it should have been the other way around, or maybe you missed something, and so on and so forth, they might be right, they might be wrong. You shouldn't feel bad about accepting that it could have been a different call, right? So they say, you missed this whole thing that we said that was really, really important. Fair enough, maybe. Maybe it wasn't as good as you thought it was. Maybe it wasn't and I missed it. But fair enough, that's debating. Like, you need to make that clear enough that I don't miss it. That's the game that we're playing, and that shouldn't make you feel like you did something wrong. Like, no, fair enough. You might have done a bad job. Like that happens. But as far as they're concerned, that's part of the game, right? Like, sometimes you don't get the best judging you could have. Sometimes you get okay judging. Sometimes you get worse than okay judging. Hopefully, all of you don't do worse than okay judging. But like, that's part of it. They don't have anything to complain about on this specific point. So the first thing is, don't let the fact that the call isn't sure affect the confidence in the process and therefore the call that you're giving. Secondly, when you explain the call that you made on some specific comparison, be very mindful of your language and of the preciseness of your language. And that is to say, if you want to talk about why the main argument from government loses to opposition, there's a very big difference if you say, this is an argument and here's why it loses. This is a major argument and this is why it loses. This is the major argument and that's why it loses. Or this is the argument by government and that's why it loses. Those are very different things and they matter a lot. And sometimes even teams that don't listen for these words, that'll still affect how they understood what you're saying. If you are able to literally walk through every argument they made and explain why that doesn't win the debate, that's great. But if you're not doing that, then don't say something that makes them think that you are going to do that, because that's the point where they won't understand and will also possibly be frustrated at the end. The same thing goes for, this argument defeats this argument, mitigates this argument, is more important than this argument, relates to this argument. Like, be very mindful and precise of your language. That makes a very big difference in how much the teams understand what you're saying and therefore also can agree with it. When possible, I prefer being as complete as possible with my explanation. So I will genuinely try when I can to say, here is the main line of argumentation from government. Here are the 6 responses throughout both of opening opposition's speeches. Here is why each one of those 6 responses isn't enough, for instance. There were other things from government, namely A, B, and C, but those things aren't as important and therefore don't matter eventually to deciding between these two teams. So if possible, I'll try to be as complete as possible. If I want to explain why closing government aren't doing as good a job as opening government, I will say, here are their arguments. This and this argument didn't show anything new and some sort of explanation there. This argument gave me 3 new sub-points, and I will literally say half sentences if possible that I think gave me something unique that wasn't there. As well, in the rebuttal, they gave a new answer to something from, like, I will try to be as complete as possible when I explain these things. That means my rankings are sometimes long, but it also means that the teams have a close to full understanding about what my understanding of the debate is. And that makes it specifically a lot less confusing for them. Because a lot of the times, I will see them having as one really good point and then a lot of like filler material. But they don't think so. They think one of those filler things is an amazing thing, and if only people understand it well, it absolutely defeats the whole debate. And if I even mention it in passing as these are one of the other things that simply I did not see their relevance in the debate, or that was not explained well enough that I think that makes a difference in the debate, they understand where I stand within their point of view. So I try to be as near completeness as possible. That's not always possible, but if I do have a good enough understanding of the debate, I think that's something that I think you should strive for. Next point, and it involves sort of 2 things in it, and they're quite, I think they're a little bit more complex, but they're also quite important, is, if you remember when we talk about judging, we talk about the average intelligent voter, or the global informed citizen, wherever 3 letters are in fashion. Whenever you're doing any sort of ranking explanation, this might not be true for feedback, but it's true for rankings, you never leave that perspective. I think it's one of those things where the average intelligent voter isn't a nice tool to help you judge. It is the way that you think about things while you're judging. And I think, for instance, it's The example that we had in the break is actually a really, really good example for that, right? So the average intelligent voter would never say, they didn't explain it well enough, but it's more intuitive, therefore I think this is the decision I will do. Right? The average intelligent voter would say, did they convince me that this is true? Not, well, they convinced me more, but this is more intuitive, so I'll go with intuitive. You always look from the perspective of somebody who's going to make this decision, which team convinced me more of their side. You never leave that perspective. That's why saying things like, this was more novel, is not a good way to prefer an argument. That's why saying this is more interesting or funny isn't a reason to do that. You never leave, when you're doing the rankings, the idea of this is the average intelligent voter. Specifically, and what comes out of that is that in order to explain your ranking well, you almost never end with adjectives. You almost never end with, and their point was deeper or more thorough or better analyzed. You almost always go this step further and ask what was in there that made it deeper or more thorough or better analyzed. So if we have opening government told us that the death penalty is scary and therefore nobody will ever murder again, and then closing government did a much better job and therefore they're first place. That's awful. You could do it slightly better, right, and say second government told us the reasons that death is actually scary and therefore people will never murder again. That's okay. That's not great because I don't understand what those I didn't get the what, right? I didn't get the, I have reasons, but sort of a what, but I didn't get the actual what. If you go into, and then second government told us that because death is an unknown and because biology has sort of fitted our brains to fear death as much as possible, and because a lot of people already know what prison is like, and therefore it doesn't really scare them in a lot of ways, and showed us how these things cause death to be more scary. Now I understand what they gave me that wasn't there. All right? Same thing, different examples. We have, this is an argument. Here are 3 good answers. Great. If you say why these answers are a good answer, what was in this answer that makes it a good answer, that's better. So never end with the adjective, always go into what was there. And again, if you are the average intelligent voter, right, it's not going to be, I thought I'm going to do this because they gave good reasons. There's always going to be something in those reasons that made those reasons good, which is what would have convinced you. You need to reach that. Yes? Yes?
Wouldn't the part of the average intelligent voter be the intuition, that is, some sort of proofs have higher burdens of proof if they are farther away from the consensus in society, etc.?
So, the average intelligent voter, and this is the sort of moves, I'm going to do this quickly because this moves into like general judging, I think, more than that. It has priors, right? The average intelligent voter has priors. It has, like, some things initially sound quite ridiculous, and I'm willing to be convinced, but that might take a little bit more work. I will try to, in general in judging, rely as little as possible on anything external to the debate. So I'd much rather not have to say, look, you tried to convince me that raising the minimum wage will turn into World War III. I think that's slightly ridiculous, and therefore you need to do a lot of work. What will usually happen is I won't actually need it. Because in order to show some sort of logical link that moves from raising the minimum wage to World War III, I won't need to talk about my priors. I will just ask, did you prove to a decent extent any step in this process? And the answer will be no, even without going back into my priors. So my priors will usually just be not necessary because they'll be a part of what is needed to prove their point. But in some cases you can't do that, usually because nobody is actually, in very bad debates where nobody actually attempts to prove anything, and then you sort of have to fall back on your priors because the debaters didn't do, I wouldn't even say a good job, didn't do a job of doing anything. Usually when debates actually have logic within them, you just don't need to rely on those priors. You can just look in the debate and you'll find it there. Last thing about giving rankings, and then we'll talk about giving feedback, and it turns out we might not have as much time as I thought for questions. That is, might not have more than 0 time for questions. This is true for the rankings and to a lesser extent about the feedback as well. The way that you write things on your paper is in part determined by what you're going to do later. That is, if you're a wing, you might not need to write something that helps you give the ranking, but if you're a chair, you usually will want to do that. So usually, when I, as a chair, look at two top half teams at the end of the top half of the debate, or at some point where I'm doing the ranking between other teams, and I realize, okay, these are the big things that I think make the difference between these teams, I'll make marks on my paper to tell me, to help me deliver the adjudication. Usually what that'll mean is, I'll decide the order in which I'd like to say the things, and then I'll just write one with a large circle around it near the first thing, and usually it'll be near the things that relate to it, and then two near the second thing, and then when I come to give the adjudication, I just look for the one, talk about what's there, look for the two, talk about what's there, look for the three, talk about what's there. I'll usually do that. If my papers are a huge mess, I might take the time to copy it to another place in order to be able to have that in a way that's clear. But throughout the debate, I also think about the fact that I will need to give an oral adjudication, and I make sure that my paper and what I have in my notes is enough to be able to do that. Last subject, giving feedback. First thing, again, just like the last point, think of it throughout the debate and write that in your notes. Have a place in your notes where you're writing down individual feedback. You're not going to remember it. It's not going to be meaningful if at the end of the debate you go back to the Prime Minister and say, what I think you should do better. What you'll end up talking about is the things that are the major clashes in the debate, which they've already heard in your rankings. So you want to write that down somewhere and have a place to do it. Second thing, your personal feedback, unlike your rankings, absolutely does not need to strive for completeness. So you don't have to talk about all the things. You don't have to talk about the major things in their speech. Sometimes a very minor thing in this debate is something that could be very useful for the person to know and could be very major in other debates. It's absolutely fine as you're going through listening to a speech and thinking about, this is a big argument, an important one, this goes into this clash, this is how this argument interacts. You see something important or unimportant in this debate, you write it down somewhere, you completely forget about it, and you then created the list of 2 or 3 things that you want to tell each speaker. So don't feel like this has to be a big thing. Usually, the beginning of speeches have not great opportunities for feedback, but mediocre backup opportunities for feedback, right? So people's decisions on how to open their speech and how they tell you about their main points or clashes, and sort of timekeeping in the beginning is a bit important, and rebuttals is like a lot of small points, some of them might be interesting for feedback. So the beginning of speeches usually has a good place to have like backup things if I don't have anything more interesting to say for feedback. So usually I'll try to, after 1 or 2 minutes of speech, have at least one point that is okay, and then if I find something better, that's great, and if not, then I work with that one. I think that's relatively useful. When you actually give that feedback, again, though slightly in a different way, you want your language to be specific, and you want your language to talk about specific sentences or things that they have done. There's a ton of bad feedback that simply tells nothing to the person who is not in your head, right? So things like points were not cohesive enough, or not persuasive enough, or not helpful enough, or I didn't buy it, or that a point was very fluffy. Like lots of different adjectives that literally tell nothing to the person who did not think that his point was not cohesive before this debate started. You have to go, again, a step further and talk about, first of all, adjectives that mean something very specific, right? Or better yet, not go with adjectives. I tell them what was missing specifically. Can you think of a sentence that would make this better? And if so, tell them that sentence, right? You were missing the logical link as to why death being unknown is something that makes it scary. I would love to understand why unknown equals scary. That's specific. If you have a sentence in your mind that could do it, that's even more helpful, okay? So you want to get to the point where you can explain to them exactly what is missing. Specifically, if that's something that's returning throughout a lot of their speech, so a lot of points, they get right into the explanations without telling you what they're actually going to talk about in this point, and you find yourself confused for a minute or two at every single argument before you understand what the hell they want to talk about. So again, the bad way to say it would be, this speech was very confusing. There wasn't a lot of structure. What does it mean there wasn't a lot of structure? Structure means a ton of different things, right? The better thing would be to say, at the beginning of every point, I want you to tell me what this point is going to be about so that I have some context. Actually good thing to say is to say that and say, for example, when you said this point, here were your first 3 sentences. Take the time, write down the quote. Here were your first 3 sentences. If I don't understand that this point is about X, I don't know if this is about X, Y, Z. And actually give the example of other things this point could be leading into. If you would tell me, here's a good first sentence, then all of these sentences are much less confusing. That's genuinely helpful. Okay, so from the point of meaningless adjectives to meaningful adjectives, to being able to give an example, to being able to give the sentence that would make it better. Okay, and that's something that you want to go towards as much as you can, the end of that line. Next thing about feedback, if at all possible, you don't want to have in building the feedback something like a report card for school where you have like 10 preset categories and then like your structure was good, your style was okay, your first point was very good, your second point was irrelevant. Like you don't want to have like preset categories to which you give. It's okay to have some of those, right? Like, well, were your arguments good or weren't they? But when you're talking about what is the most useful feedback, it's always best if the category that you're rating the person on or telling them that they could improve is also something that is specifically interesting in the case of this speech or this person, right? And a lot of times the best feedback that you could get is feedback that you wouldn't have thought of this as a category for feedback ahead of time, but looking at the speech is something that's very unique and interesting. And again, this relates to the specificity, right? So saying your structure wasn't very good is a sort of report card type category. If you look at what within the structure isn't very good, that's a question for feedback that would be specific to the user, right? To the specific debater, right? So if you would say, not your structure isn't very good, but it seems like you had these 3 ideas that came back again every single point that you have, and therefore you're coming back to the same things over and over again, both confusing me and wasting your time. That's something that's specific, and that's a category that you're rating this person on that wouldn't have been a generic report card category. Lastly, especially with debaters who aren't very experienced or aren't very good, don't be afraid to link the specific things that they did to general best practices in debate. Okay? You don't want to give like overall generic feedback. It's very important to engage with everything that the other team is saying, but if that's their problem, it's okay to link the specific thing, explain what was important here, and then link it to the general practice. This was the major point by the other team. You gave it this very, very short rebuttal, which takes a huge risk in me not thinking that rebuttal is very good. Specifically, that's what happened in this debate. And by taking this risk, if that happens, then you don't have an answer to the major part of their case. In general, it's really important to understand that if this is such a big part of that case, not take as big a risk and think of either a few more answers that are different from each other, or take more time to make sure that I agree with the one answer that you do have to their case. So linking it to the general thing, not only giving the general thing, but linking it to the general thing is something very useful. Don't be nervous if you're new and over-prepare. Make sure the discussion is as relevant as possible, thinking of the decision tree and figuring out how that works with time. Dealing with problematic wings, either ones that are obstructing, and we talked about the sort of tools that you have to deal with that, and ones that aren't very good, and the tools that you have over there. Giving feedback and rankings, making it specific, making it helpful, not using the adjectives, and giving eventual feedback, and again, trying to be as specific as possible and talking about something that's relevant to the specific person. Thank you very much. I think we don't actually have time for a question.